You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to Kerry Greenaway and Mark Manley on the Dark Mirror Paranormal Show, only on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening and welcome to the Dark Mirror Paranormal Show. My name is Kerry Greenaway and as always I'm joined by my lovely Mark Manley. Good evening, Mark.
My name is Dr. Evil. Not...
Oh God, he started already.
It's the wine, you know. Yeah, no, yes I am. I shall call him Mini-Me.
It's the Friday night paranormal show. Oh my God, and we've started already. Okay. How are you doing, Mark?
Yeah, fine. Everything's packed up. I'm ready to move, and I have got to drive to Yorkshire tomorrow. And the day after, I've got to get a big van in Yorkshire and drive to London, and then back to Yorkshire in the same day. So basically, I'm doing almost 1,000 miles in 2 days. So yes, I'm looking forward to it.
And in between all that, I'm dragging you on to do a radio show. Don't you just love me?
Yeah, lots of drugs are going to help as well. So you know.
Oh my God. Red Bull. That's what you need, boy. It's Red Bull.
I haven't got read anything, thank you.
Anyway, moving swiftly on with the show.
No, it's fine.
Last week, we had a look at ghosts in the machine, if you remember rightly. And this week, I thought we'd continue the theme with spirits in the sky. Because
to the spirit in the sky. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I've got it out of me now.
Okay. So, anyway.
Oh,
Mark brought a subject to the table last week in the research that I looked into and I dismissed for last week's show, but he wanted to have a look at it. So we're going to have a look at it. Now, when we talked about ghosts in the machine, we looked at instrumental transcommunication, which is basically defined as communication by spirit beings with human beings via telephones, tape recorders, televisions, computers, and by other electronic devices. This communications can involve images projected onto TV screens or computer monitors as well. However, there are other forms of machines that we have on a daily basis or see on a daily basis.
Just because they buzz does not mean you're contacting any spirits. Carry on.
This is true. Like planes, trains, automobiles, all that kind of thing. So it kind of leads on from last week's show. And the subject that Mark brought to the table was something that happened in World War II.
That's right.
Something called the gremlins. So we thought we'd have a little look at the gremlins to start with, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I know, my late grandfather, he was a Spitfire pilot and wing commander in the Second World War. And I can remember him talking about it back then. And I remember seeing the Twilight Zone and God knows what other things, talking about gremlins and ghosts in the machines. And those terms came from the Second World War pilots. I think it predominantly started with the American pilots, and then the English pilots took it on when the Americans started flying with us. So there's a lot to be said for it. And we are not talking cross-dressing monsters either.
No, but when we first think of gremlins, the first image that pops into our heads is that of the strange, like, little creatures from the film.
Yeah, Mogwai.
Who?
Mogwai!
I've never seen it. I'm not going. I'll admit that live on air. I've never seen the gremlins.
Well, then you need to get a life. Before they turn into gremlins, they are called Mogwai, and they're cute, furry little things.
See, I know the image. I know the images. I think you must have died if you haven't recognised the image of when someone says gremlins. It conjures up that image. But, excuse me. I haven't actually seen the film.
Oh, my God. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it first. She's too busy playing with her rocks and things. There you go.
I am. I'm too busy playing with crystals and rocks to watch films like this. It was 1984, though. I was probably out clubbing.
How old are you?
Too old.
You were, I think you were about a year older than me, if that. So you shouldn't have been clubbing then.
I kind of was.
Oh, you naughty girl! Oh, my God. No wonder you're such a bad flipping influence on people. Oh. That's why my missus has turned into a rebel, got her hair spiked and wears a leather jacket. It's because of you, isn't it?
Yeah. What can I say? What can I say?
Without a clue.
It's a life before this life I lead now.
Having said that, my missus is just sort of looking at her phone and shaking her head slightly as if to say, really? Yep, she is.
All I can say is I was awesome back then. If you think I'm awesome now, I was even more awesome back then.
Hey, you've turned into a MILF now, haven't you?
I like to think so.
Right, go on.
Anyway, moving on with the subject. Okay, so gremlins. The origin of the modern term gremlin is actually quite disputed, but it is often said to derive from the Old English word of grem, which means to vex or annoy. And it refers to a typical... It's quite folklore-y, actually, gremlins, because it refers to a mischievous gnome-like imp or demon, said to be around about a foot tall, and, kind of links in with goblins and fairies.
The 2-year-old, 1.5-year-old's teething then.
Yeah, I kind of think that's kind of where they may have got it from, because they are very gremlin-like at that age. Now, one of the earliest representations even,
Yep.
I can't speak, I've lost it already, of these creatures was that of skilled craftsmen with superhuman proficiency with machinery of all types. And they were once credited by some with helping mankind along with our technology, apparently.
Which also stems to... There's also legends of them stem back to precursors and aliens, but we won't go into that for today. Aliens! There you go.
Oh,
sorry. There you go. Did another one. Every single time.
Every week. I try and steer you away from the alien thing, and every week you have to pop it in, don't you?
You just said that. My missus says that as well. You just said
Yeah, but I don't say it like you.
No, but you just said the word alien, so... No.
No, it was their thing for mischief and mayhem that would become most known for, that they became most known for. And the modern version of the gremlin is a malicious, troublemaking hellraiser. Gosh, that sounds like me back in my teenage years. And has...
did. Still flipping out.
Well, I just do it a lot more quietly these days. I don't talk about it. Now, in World War II, the British airmen kind of took this gremlin thing on and really ran with the idea. Now, the old Royal Naval Air Service in 1917 and the reconstituted Royal Air Force in 1918 appear to have detected the existence of a horde of mysterious and malicious sprites whose whole purpose in life was to bring about as many as possible inexplicable mishaps that troubled airmen's life.
You've got mans and men's on the mind, haven't you?
Well, I have tonight because we're talking about airmen.
It's a good job you weren't talking about Navy.
Now, I tried to join the Navy back in the day.
You in a small metal tube filled with semen. Oh my God, that would be bad.
Oh my God, I can't believe you said that. Yeah, they didn't accept me, strangely. I have no idea why. I do know why, but... Anyway, it's a whole different story. Now, the existence of such weird entities became truly popularised in 1923, allegedly, when a British pilot crashed his plane into the sea and later reported that the accident had been caused by tiny creatures which had followed him aboard his plane and proceeded to create havoc aboard his aircraft, sabotaging the engine, messing around with flight controls, and ultimately causing it to crash. Seriously?
Can I tell you a little unknown fact about that? The Twilight Zone episode of that, what was it, Death at 20,000 Feet, from the original 1960s episode, I hasten to add, which was way before I was born, that they took the idea for that episode from this particular story.
Mm.
So there you go. Impressed now, aren't you?
I am quite impressed, actually.
Yeah, see?
Anyway, this story spread, and it wasn't long before other British pilots also began to complain of being harassed by similar miniature troll-like little creatures with a mastery of technology and machinery.
It sounds like my dad.
Which caused engine failures, electrical malfunctions, communication shutdowns, bad landings, freak accidents, and just pretty much anything else that they could blame on these little gremlins. I mean, they kind of had a bit of a bad rap.
Yeah, they did chart in the top 10 hits with "Jesus, your rap sucks," but that, I didn't get anywhere else.
See, I mean, at this point, my scepticism, I have a huge respect for folklore, but with this one, I have to say I was a little sceptical.
Yeah.
With this one, because they kind of got the rap for everything that went wrong. Everything that went wrong with aircraft.
The RAF was in its infancy and is the youngest service. So, I personally think that back then, especially the First World War, because you used to the flying corps actually started in the army, so it was the army air flying corps. So there used to be a lot of Irish mechanics, and I personally, my own point of view, because I am Irish and my father was ex-SAS and Irish, and the guy believed in leprechauns. That's all I say. Putting it out there. My dad, SAS hero, believed in leprechauns. We'll leave that one there. But I do think that a lot of the mechanics, possibly, whether it be through spirits of one kind or another, may have been confusing leprechauns and just turned it into something else. I don't know. It's my own personal opinion.
Okay. Well, now, looking into some of the stories that these gremlins were supposed to have, caused, some of the problems they were supposed to have caused. I mean, come on, right? Sucking the gas out of tanks.
Gas?
I know, I'm lost tonight. Sucking the gas out of tanks through hoses, jamming radio frequencies, mucking up landing gear, blowing dust or sand into fuel pipes or sensitive electrical equipment, cutting wires, removing bolts or screws, tinkering with dials, knobs or switches, jostling controls, slashing wings or tyres, poking or pinching gunners or pilots, banging incessantly on the fuselage.
Can't they just go to a hotel for that?
Breaking windows. I mean, all these things I'm reading and I'm thinking, going back in the day, like you say, the Air Force was in its infancy.
Yeah, exactly.
The aircraft were probably not made to the best quality like they are in this day and age. In fact, the more I read about aircraft, the more I think the miraculous feats that the aircraft did back in World War One and World War Two. I'm in awe, actually, of the bravery of the people, of the lads.
First World War is all handmade, and Second World War, yes, planes were mass-produced on the factory floor, but they had to be maintained and looked after at air bases which didn't have a factory, so it was all hand looked after. So
Exactly. I mean, I am in awe of the World War pilots, because how... when you look at it in this day and age, even going up in a standard aircraft, it's quite daunting at times, let alone when you've got these kind of situations happening. I mean, okay, blame it on a gremlin, blame it on something else other than your own responsibility, but it must have been a very good way of overcoming that self-responsibility, I suppose, under extremely stressful circumstances.
Well, yeah, it was also a way of passing the buck. But another little thing, which I'll let you into, you know, I'm a biker.
Yeah.
Yes. If you look at the Harleys in America, and I think some of the Harleys over here are doing it now, you'll see somewhere on the front forks up near the clocks and everything, a little tiny bell which has engravings on it, and that's called a gremlin bell, and it's there so that the bell scares away the gremlins and it doesn't do any harm to the bikes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, gremlin bells. You look them up.
I have to.
But it's predominantly America.
No comment.
Well, gremlin bells, Trump, sounds kind of familiar. Sound kind of the same, you know. But, yeah.
Okay. Right. Now, there were even pilots that claimed that these creatures had telepathic powers and could recreate realistic illusions in the victim's mind, such as the appearance of a ground or the mountains emerging suddenly from behind the clouds. And they were sometimes reported to be seen sitting out on the nose of the plane or wings of the aircraft in mid-flight, tampering with the wings or even the engines. I mean, on occasion, the gremlins were said to shout, giggle, whisper or growl, or otherwise make noise so as to distract aircraft crews. Now, in particular, gunners, as they were lining up their sights on an enemy, and again, bearing in mind the conditions these guys are operating under, and the manoeuvres that they would have had to have taken under extremely challenging conditions, you know, these reports suddenly started swiftly moving through the ranks. And by the end of the 1920s, it seemed like any pilot who had ever had any kind of aircraft problem had kind of seen these things or said they had seen these things. Now, it spread. It didn't just start, you know, it started, from what I researched, it seemed to start in the UK, but it spread through pilots that were stationed as far as Malta, the Middle East and India.
It went all over the place in the Second World War, but as far as I know, it originally started. It wasn't First World War as such. It originally started when the American and Canadian pilots came over and were mixing with the other RAF flight crews and everything, and were doing joint flights. And they were the first people to actually coin the phrase, "Gee, there's a gremlin down there," you know? Well,
when I first looked into this, I came across a case from a very early case back in 1927, basically. So we're talking like pre-World War II.
It was American.
You know, and a guy called Charles Lindbergh, as he apparently did an historic non-stop solo flight over the Atlantic from New York to Paris.
He actually did, yeah.
And he was flying his single-engine, single-seated plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Is this what the film?
Yeah.
With Leonardo DiCaprio was based on?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It really did happen. He did it, and he became an overnight hero. Thousands of people turned out at the Paris airport to watch him land, and he was made a national hero.
Well, this is an epic 3,600-mile journey, which equates to 5,800 kilometres, and it was a 33-and-a-half-hour flight, and it was the first ever of its kind. However, in around the 9th hour of being airborne, Charles Lindbergh was nearing the they say it was the halfway mark, but I got conflicting reports on this. Some say it was the 9th hour, some say it was the halfway mark. So it was a bit conflicting when exactly this happened to him. But he was like halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, but he suddenly became conscious of tiny, transparent-like creatures floating inside the plane. And I found a quote, should I say, From Charles Lindbergh, which said, I saw them plain as day, transparent forms that moved freely about. They looked grim and menacing, but I never once felt frightened.
I suspect my in-laws were there.
Lindbergh called the creatures spirits. He said they spoke in friendly voices, discussed navigation and reassured him of his safety. And they also imparted information of a mystical nature that the aviator chose never to reveal for fear of ridicule. I'm having to say this. That's a little bit hypocritical, bearing in mind he's quite happy to talk about transparent forms called spirits, but didn't want to impart any mystical natured information that he was given. It's a little... you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you know that, I mean, if you do hours and hours of driving or piloting any vehicle of any type, be it car, bike, whatever, if you're doing it for that long, say that was like halfway through, talking well over 12 hours of non-stop, you're going to start seeing things.
Exactly.
It's a known fact. It's a well-known fact. If you're busy concentrating on one thing for that amount of time, you're going to start seeing or hearing things or think you're going doolally. Because, as you know yourself, your brain produces toxins when you're awake, and the whole reason is sleep is so that your brain can wash the toxins away. So, if he's not slept, and I'm guessing he would have been up for at least a couple of hours before he left, and then he's got all that on top and all the concentrating, he was probably just suffering from the effects of the brain chemicals,
Well, there's lots of different factors. I mean, we'll go into this in a little bit, but there's loads of different factors regarding flying that should be considered before jumping to the conclusion that you have little imp-like gremlins running around your aircraft.
This is your captain speaking. Please do not look out of the left wing, because you stripe the gremlin grinning at you whilst pulling off fuselage and the ailerons to bits. Thank you.
Exactly my point. Kind of exactly my point. I mean, okay, so I was in a lovely, 747 going to the Caribbean, 9-hour flight. Have to say, plenty of alcohol flowing. I never saw a gremlin.
Right.
Alcohol seems to feature quite strongly in my life, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, I'm not saying anything, lush, or anything like that, but,
Anyway, back to topic. The actual physical descriptions of gremlins are quite varied, aren't they, Mark?
Yeah, some look like me. In some cases, being little elfish beings similar to humans, wearing bright red or green double-breasted frock coats, but that also stems to the leprechauns as well. Or old-fashioned hats with feathers and pointed shoes. That's the Tyrolean type ones, the shoemaker and the elves. Skin colour could also be green or red.
Just imagine these little elves with like feather boas. I'm sorry, I've gone off on a tangent.
Feather boas? Look, you want to lay off those certain web channels at night.
I'm so sorry, carry on.
God. Yeah, anyway. No, you've done it now, because if you watch Gremlins, you will see one of the Gremlins wearing a feather boa and big Elton John glasses.
Oh my goodness me. Anyway.
Yes. I just gave the entities a more sinister appearance. Saying that they looked more like Kerry Greenaway with hairy bodies, large pointed ears. Still other reports speak of gremlins as having hairless grey skin. Aliens! Being vaguely reptilian in appearance and having enormous mouths filled with pointy teeth. There are also cases that said they look like jackrabbits, bull terriers, or sometimes a combination of both. So, in other words, they've been to Somerset and seen my ex-in-laws. In some cases, they were merely wispy entities, seemingly composed of mist or smoke. It makes me wonder what they were smoking in the cockpit back then. And some accounts mention webbed hands and feet, fins, or bat-like wings. Size descriptions also vary considerably, with gremlins said to be anywhere between a mere 6 inches tall all the way up to 3 feet in height. And I strongly suspect, if you look at the stories of who said about these gremlins, it'll be men. Because let's face it, most men lie their heads off about anything between 6 inches of 3 feet tall.
You can imagine. No, you can imagine when they've done the flight, they've gone back to their mess area and they're having a drink, and it's almost like a standoff of who had the scariest or the most weirdest gremlin whilst they were flying their missions. You can almost see like a top trumps of the gremlin, can't you?
They're in a sergeant's mess getting beat up. Like, that's nothing. I said I was flying out of Berlin. I dropped my load. I was just coming back. And this little bugger, he must have been about 16 inches up. He come round, took out a pen from my cockpit, looked at me, saluted, went, and jumped off the plane. Oh, God, blimey, it scared me, Governor. It did.
Exactly my point. Yeah, beautifully illustrated there, my darling. But one common trait in all reports is that through whatever means, the gremlins were known to be able to adhere to the outer fuselages of planes and withstand incredible temperature extremes, high altitudes and violent winds.
They weren't of this world anyway.
Basically, yes. Now, they were reported throughout the 1920s and 30s, but the most intense period of gremlin activity, I love this, was during the fierce fighting of World War II. Now, this is where my scepticism jumped a huge amount, because I started reading about gremlins and I'm like, okay, folklore could be misinterpreted, blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, I just can't do this any longer. Okay, let's do a little bit more deeper research on this subject.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a book. I did.
Is that right about the date, though? Because I would never have thought that he would have been writing way back then.
He was.
Okay. Must have been young.
In 1943, which is actually post-period of what we're talking about, which is the Battle of Britain, when the most fiercest fighting took place in the skies above our beloved land. And, Roald Dahl actually wrote a book in 1943. But...
And what was the book called?
The book was actually called The Gremlins. And it was based in the Battle of Britain in 1940.
Strange that.
Strangely coincidental that all the stories regarding gremlins start exactly around the same time frame that Roald Dahl writes this book 3 years later, but all the stories I could find based in 1940. It just seemed too much of a coincidence for me. Now, the story concerns mischievous mythical creatures, the gremlins, and invoked by Royal Air Force pilots as an explanation of mechanical troubles and mishaps. In Dahl's book, the gremlins' motivation for sabotaging British aircraft is revenge for the destruction of their forest home, which was razed to make way for aircraft factories. And the principal character in the book, Gus, has his Hawker Hurricane fighter destroyed over the English Channel by a gremlin, but is able to convince the gremlins as they parachute into the water that they should join forces against a common enemy, i.e. Hitler and the Nazis, rather than fight each other. And that was the point I suddenly went, oh, light bulb moment, all of a sudden, bing! Okay, fair enough. That kind of explains quite a lot of what I'd been reading up to that point.
Yeah. It's a bit of what's the word you want? Propaganda fitting for us.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But the stories continued. I kept finding story after story after story. Now, between 1940 and 1942, again pre this book that came out, reports of gremlins were especially prolific amongst the UK's Royal Air Force units, especially the high-altitude photographic reconnaissance units. Now, these guys, oh my goodness, again, all kudos to those guys for their courage. Now, they were unarmed, Spitfires, Mosquitoes, flying at great heights on photographic missions over enemy territory. And these, you can't even imagine the conditions that these guys are flying in. Now, you have to remember the aircraft that the guys were flying. You have to remember this. They were very basic, weren't they, Mark?
I can tell you a bit about the planes, actually.
Go on.
They used to have to fly so high so that the Akat guns couldn't touch them. So they were flying at least 1,000 feet above the top range of the strongest Akat guns. So you're talking almost stratosphere. Mosquito planes, the fuselage is predominantly wooden, if I care to remember. And to make the guns lighter and less susceptible to dropping or anything, they had to strip them of all the Hispano and Browning cannons that they had on there, any type of weapon and anything else. And the people that took the photographs, because it was if they were in a Spitfire, there was actually two people in there. You had the pilot and you had a guy lying down in the fuselage looking through an aperture which was in the base of the aircraft. And the same with the Mosquitoes. Whoever took the photos was lying down. And you've got to remember, normal flight suits wouldn't keep warm enough. They had specially made flight suits up in the air in wooden planes, thousands of feet up and way above the highest range of the Akat guns. So, and they had to have oxygen masks and oxygen because there wasn't enough air. So these guys not only had to rely on the oxygen, because if they took them off, they would start seeing things. They also had to rely on their gear, their warm weather gear, which in a lot of cases didn't actually keep them warm enough. And loads of these guys came back down with hypothermia and everything.
Okay, and a lot of the heat was actually redirected to the cameras to keep them warm. Now,
exactly.
At this point, let's just take a quick break and then continue with this discussion straight after.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
Oh, welcome back to the Dark Mirror Show. Tonight we are talking about spirits in the sky, and we've started off with a folklore story called The Gremlins that was apparent in World War II. Now, we've talked a little bit about what these gremlins were supposed to be and what they do. We also talked about Roald Dahl, who wrote a book in 1943. And now we're looking at the photographic reconnaissance units regarding the gremlins that were regularly seen and blamed for all manner of otherwise inexplicable technical troubles and woes. Now, a lot of these mechanical problems would arise only to mysteriously right themselves again as soon as the planes landed. However, as we've discussed, it could well be a very normal reasons as to why these situations occurred. You know, we're talking back in the day, we're talking all sorts of reasons why they would occur. And Mark was talking to us a little bit more about the conditions that these pilots were flying under in the kind of planes they were flying. Now, in 1940, the Battle of Britain was an enormous air campaign that was waged by the UK against the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, during the summer and autumn of 1940. But a lot of the cases that I read about were actually focused in this period of time. Now, one article that I read was that said that the British Air Ministry even acknowledged the problem and made serious attempts to investigate the phenomenon. The ministry even went as far as to have a service manual written up by a gremlorist pilot officer, Percy Prune. Or did they? Now, again, I looked into this and because I was thinking, really? Did they? Oh, my God. Seriously?
The poop name, Percy Prune.
Yeah, Percy Prune. I mean, that's a name and a half in itself.
Exactly.
And the more I looked into this one, the more I found that Percy Prune was actually a fictional character, and it was written in an RAF publication called a TM. Now, the TM actually is shorthand for Training Memorandum, and it was first published in 1941, and it introduced the hapless pilot of Percy Prune. Now, Percy...
At that point, I tell you what, I've got to say one thing. You wouldn't want to be a co-pilot up in the air with Percy Prune. So, yeah,
you wouldn't have. Now, Percy Prune actually was very, very comical. Even I found it quite humorous in places. But the TM provided... It was actually like a light-hearted magazine, but had a serious message behind it. That's kind of where it was. And Percy got a life of his own, basically. He had like the black finger. They called it the black finger. So if you made some stupid mistake or other, you were given like a black finger or 2 black fingers or 3 black fingers, for depending on the crime, I suppose you'd call it, in inverted commas.
I normally get that when I get my hammer.
Or the stupidity of your antics in the air. He was very, very light-hearted. It was done in a very, very individual way. I mean, a very hoorah Henry kind of way. When I was reading it, yeah, very like stiff upper lip English kind of way.
Yeah,
but
very, very, yes,
very officery.
Yeah.
However, what it did do was it offered lack of stiffness in presentation of training and gave instructional points and information in a really light-hearted kind of way. So it's a way of getting the message across without, I reiterate, extreme circumstances and pressures that the guys were under back then. I don't think anybody these days could fully appreciate that kind of pressure.
No, exactly. They had to have something to lighten the mood. They had to have something to stop people getting scared at the tale of gremlins, or, oh, Jesus, if you go up in the air, the gremlins are going to tear your plane around. So they had to have a little story to just try and inject a bit of humour into it. People wouldn't take it so seriously. It was a serious thing that there were faults with the planes and everything. And a lot of the reasons that the reconnaissance planes were having so many problems is because they were flying so high. The coldness was shutting down so much equipment. But as they came lower and lower and lower, coming back into land, it warmed the stuff back up again. That's why it normally started working again just before they landed.
Exactly the point. I mean, Percy had a very couldn't care less attitude in the magazine. His attitude to flying and operations often echoed other people's errors that they'd come across. Excuse me.
Cough it up, love.
I know. Sorry. Landing with the undercut up was just a mistake, explained the pilot officer. And many pilots had used that as an excuse. You know, another thing that he had said in one of these magazines was a good landing is one you can walk away from, was another gem. And we are told that Prune's navigator, Flying Officer Fix, love that, used to complain that Prune flew so close to the deck over the channel that he had to stand up to see over the waves, with the pilot head registering fathoms instead of IAS. Which I don't know what IAS is, but it's obviously a flying term.
It is. I'm clever, but I'm not that clever.
Anyway, the light-hearted TM, obviously, you know, as I said before, his training memorandum was regularly viewed as an official document and often consisted of a list of the creature's exploits, of how to placate or distract them, and various ways to avoid accidents due to the gremlins' presence. So you can kind of see where this whole mythology regarding gremlins in World War II kind of started building up at this point, can't you?
By the way, IAS is indicated airspeed.
Ah, well done. I'm impressed.
You're easily impressed.
Oh, I know. It's true that. Now, it also suggested ways so not to display bravado, arrogance or overconfidence, which was thought to attract the creatures. So you can see how this training memorandum is trying to sort of like make lightheartedness out of an intense situation, but also, you know, sort of like don't get too overconfident, don't get too arrogant about your flying skills. You know what I mean? It's sort of like measuring their... You need them to be confident and courageous and, you know, all these things, but you can't get overconfident or over courageous because you're going to attract those gremlins and you don't want them gremlins. It's kind of, I can see how they made this mythology work for them.
Exactly. I mean, they're basically saying, look after your equipment and wind your neck in.
Exactly. Or look after your equipment as best you can, being as it's not particularly great equipment.
And a lot of the things with the sound and stuff, when you had the RAF regiments over in the desert, when they're fighting Rommel, all of their planes used to suffer badly from sucking in sand through the air intakes. And that was a real bane for the RAF when they were over there.
Well, you can imagine, can't you? It's bad enough now. I mean, you think when the volcanoes kick off, but you think the Icelandic volcano that kicked off a few years ago, it grounded all the aircraft for that very problem.
Yeah, I know. I can remember on my last job when that happened, we suddenly had thousands and thousands and thousands of people ringing up saying, I need a Mercedes now.
I need a Mercedes.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? Sorry, got sidetracked.
Going on up to the spirit in the sky.
Anyway, there were even posters made up that warned of these malicious little monsters, as well as bulletins which often included...
Didn't I see a poster about you?
Pardon?
Didn't I see a poster about you like that?
What? Malicious little monster?
Yeah, you see this woman here, Kerry Greenaway. Stay away, she's bad news.
Not recently, I wouldn't have thought.
She will drink you dry and then probably sell your clothes as well.
No, that's you drinking me dry, if you remember rightly.
No, I told you after last time I refused to do it because you never paid enough.
Anyway, there were bulletins as well. Let's move swiftly on. Do you want to tell them the little tale or the little poem that was made about gremlins?
Do you want me to do the voices as well?
Oh, I think you need to on this one.
Okay. This is the tale of the gremlins as told by the Prue. At Benton and Wick and St. Eval, and believe me, you slobs, it's true. When you're 7 miles up in the heavens, it's a hell of a lonely spot, and it's 50 degrees below zero, which isn't exactly hot. When you're frozen blue, like a spitfire, when you're and you're scared, a mosquito pink. When you're thousands of miles from nowhere, and there's nothing below but the drink, jolly hockey sticks, it's then that you'll see the gremlins, green and gamboge and gold. I just painted you with gold, male and female and neuter, gremlins both young and old. It's no good trying to dodge them. The lessons you learned on the link won't help you evade a gremlin, although you boost and you dive and you jink. White ones will wiggle your wingtips. Male ones will muddle your maps. Green ones will guzzle your glycol. Females will flutter your flaps. Oh, dear Lord. Pink ones will perch on your perspex and dance pirouettes on your prop. There's a spherical middle-aged gremlin who'll spin on your stick like a top. They'll freeze up your camera shutters. They'll bite through your aileron wires. They'll bend and they'll break and they'll batter. They'll insert toasting forks into your tires. And that is the tale of the gremlins, as told by the Prue. Pretty, ruddy, unlikely to many, but a fact nonetheless to the few.
Exactly. I mean, this has literally took a life of its own in World War II. I mean, amongst the RAF, it's quite fascinating when you look into this folklore of the gremlins. It really was. Now, it seemed to be a phenomenon completely unique to the Royal Air Force, and it was often whispered amongst the airmen that the gremlins were in league with the enemy. But it later became apparent that enemy aircraft, see, this folklore spread.
You could just say, can't you? They have ways of buggering your aircraft up.
You can imagine, can't you? Were also suffering from the creatures' tomfoolery, so that they didn't take sides, guys. Gremlins didn't take sides. They were taking equal glee in harassing both British and enemy aircraft alike. When the American allies came to British shores, they too began to experience the strange phenomena. American pilots and airmen typically describe seeing strange creatures out on the wings of aircraft, where they would fiddle around with the aileron, which is the hinged flight control surface on the wing that allows it to roll or bank, basically. That's what one of them is. Now, so persistent were these stories, which I can imagine the Americans took and ran with, in all honesty. They're a lot more gun-ho than our British guys, aren't they?
Jay, she doesn't mean it. Oh,
Now,
right,
the
yes, it does.
Americans
They
often...
are gung-ho. Yes. Very
Yeah.
devil may care.
They do have that more... No, I think what Americans have is that actually it's not a bad thing to have, in all honesty. It's that I'm the best. I can do it. I have more courage. I have, more faith in myself. They have that ability, don't they? That confidence that, British have the stiff upper lip, and it's, we're in for a team, and it's all, we're doing it with resolve and boldness. But the Americans are like the confidence and the courage. It's a lot more apparent in Americans. Now, they referred to the creatures as Yehudis after the famous violinist at the time because they were always fiddling. I love it.
Yehudi Menuhin.
Yehudi Menuhin, exactly. Now, I did try to find a more up-to-date case of little gremlins, and I couldn't.
Yes.
Not really.
Yes.
I found one regarding a Boeing B-17 who had rather bizarre and harrowing experiences, and I had another incident from an aircraft in 1939, which is actually before America participated in the war. But it's worth mentioning because this was quite an interesting one I found. This is to do with the transport plane that left the Marine Naval Air Force Base in San Diego, California at around 3:30 in the afternoon in 1939. It was just a routine flight to Honolulu with a crew of 13. Now, somewhere around 3 hours into the flight, it was reported that the aircraft suddenly made a distressed call, and all the communications then went dead. Despite the fact that its radio had gone completely silent, the plane managed to arrive back at its base. Yet the way it limped in for a bumpy, sloppy emergency landing and heavy damage on its exterior, it almost looked like it had missile damage. And it immediately, struck a chord with the ground crew. Now, as soon as it reached to a halt, the crews moved in to investigate, and what they found horrified them. The interior of the craft was uncovered the bodies of 12 of the plane's crew, all of them displaying gruesome gaping wounds of unknown origins. Further adding to the strangeness was the fact that the whole cabin reeked of a wretched sulphuric stench, and there were empty bullet shells strewn about the floor of the cockpit, as well as the pilot and co-pilot's empty firearms, indicating that the dead men had frantically fired at something. Now, the only survivor was the co-pilot, who had managed to land the plane despite being severely wounded himself, but he died before he could give any account of what had actually happened on their flight. Now, what struck me about that one was, I'm not very good with geography, Mark, as you know. Now, the routine flight between California and Honolulu, does that not pass through the Bermuda Triangle?
I was just about to say that. I'm sure it does. California is on the west coast, isn't it? Yeah, west coast. If it's going to Honolulu... No, that's all... I think it would... If it did, it just touches it.
Well, it's that kind of area, isn't it? And as we know, the Bermuda Triangle is full of strange and weird occurrences.
Well, the thing that's worried me there is it said about the sulphuric smell, and I'm wondering if these poor sods were a tester for some sort of nerve gas or toxin that was being used, and they were the test dummies, unbeknownst to them.
Or maybe that's because it was, when you look at it, it was a cargo ship, wasn't it? A cargo plane, wasn't it? It was just like a general thing. So it could easily be something like that. A transport plane.
Yeah, exactly. If they were seeing things, they were probably shooting at each other.
Yeah, and the hallucinations can be incredibly vivid.
Yeah, I can remember that time you took that LSD tablet. Yeah, I remember that.
Oh my God, will you stop saying things like this? I'm not
She hasn't really. She hasn't really. It was ecstasy. Anyway.
Anyway. As I say, when I was looking into this, there are many, many different accounts, and we could go on and on about different accounts, but I want to look into more normal methods. Let's have a look at, what could have caused this mythology that built up. I mean, first of all, obviously, It was turned into the RAF's advantage by good old Percy as a kind of training hidden within humour in their TMs. Do you know what I mean? That's an incredible marketing tool, I have to say. But we've talked before about the conditions of this plane. So I looked into various, conditions that you could, come across in these kind of conditions. Now, one of those is obviously lack of adequate pressurization of aircraft. I mean, that can lead to hallucinations.
Well, yeah. Also, if it was carrying a particular substance in there, and it was in an unpressurized aircraft, the pressure would probably crack the canister as well.
Exactly. I mean, when you start breaking it down, we talked about the conditions on the plane, the freezing conditions. I mean, the planes were so basic. It was noisy. It was cramped and cold. I mean, the temperature could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius.
That's right.
Up in those planes. That's cold enough to freeze exposed flesh if it touched metal.
That's right. A lot of them would pee in their flight suits to just keep themselves warm, but that would actually, in hindsight, give them a lot worse case of hypothermia because it eventually got cold and froze.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
there's lots of cases of that.
Can you imagine that? I mean, the rear gunner was often called a guy called Tail End Charlie. That was his nickname. He was directly exposed to the freezing night air because he would often knock out a panel from his gun turret to increase his chances of spotting German flyers. I mean, again, think about the conditions they were flying under. Think about the technology that they were using. The actual panel probably would frost up with frost at that kind of height.
It was glass. It wasn't perspex or anything. It was way before they could invent that. It was just toughened glass.
Exactly. So, it freezes over. They can't see nothing out of it. So they've got no choice but to, to stand half a chance, they've got to knock this panel out. And then they're exposed to the freezing night air just to defend themselves.
And you've got to remember that the glass panels themselves, they weren't small because most guns on certainly the British fighters and bombers were 50 caliber, and they were normally Browning or Hispano. And so we're talking big guns, and you need a big area of fire. So the glass panels that surrounded the main hole that the muzzles poked out, they were big things. I mean, we're talking sort of like each panel was about the size of a 12 by 12 photo frame, picture frame.
Mm.
So if they've kicked one of them out just so they can get a better view, they're going to be freezing everything off.
I mean, you've got to remember, hypothermia probably wasn't understood in the same terms as it is in this day and age.
No, exactly.
So, that was one explanation I came up with. Air sickness was another one I thought about. Now, air sickness was actually more of a problem when they were training. I mean, 40% of pilots that were trained in World War II experienced air sickness, causing nausea and disorientation.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, actually, because a lot of them had never flown before in their lives or even been on a plane.
You know what? I actually read a really horrifying statistic regarding air sickness when I was looking into this. I was focused on the Battle of Britain, the fighter pilots more than anything else. But don't forget they used to transport troops to parachute into enemy territory. And those guys never had flown before. So what they used to do was give them this tablet, the air sickness tablet. But this was not the air sickness tablets that you get now nowadays. What they used to do, this was very trials. So the sickness tablets that they gave them back then was they caused real extreme drowsiness, and they would be basically throwing them out the plane half asleep. So with the sickness tablets, the altitude sickness, the hypothermia, but half of them weren't even with it when they landed in enemy territory. And that, you're bearing in mind, you're landing in enemy territory and you're supposed to be on the ball. I mean, at the point of landing, you've got to be on the ball. You've got to sort of get yourself to safety or start firing before you even land. in the territory. And they've been drugged up with these untested air sickness tablets. It was horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. It threw a whole new light onto it for me. It was disgusting.
No, I know what you mean, but you've got to remember that First World War and Second World War, a lot of the soldiers' medicines, or a lot of the medicines that everybody had access to, normally had things like cocaine or laudanum or something like that in them. But one thing I will say is the pilots that did land behind enemy lines, it was normally Western Lysanders dropping off or picking up spies. So you only had 1 or 2 crew in those anyway. But yeah, they did have those tablets. But the main things that would land, would be the gliders, and it was normally the glider pilots who'd never flown before, and it was normally them that were given these tablets because they were scared stupid. And there's been so many cases of gliders full of paratroopers, and you've had 10 gliders being towed. The tow hitch is gone. They've had to go in behind enemy lines, and like one plane survived. One glider survived.
Absolutely horrendous.
Exactly.
Absolutely horrendous. Now, altitude sickness I looked into. At the outset of the war, aircrafts were neither pressurised nor heated, but air crews flew as high as possible, as we've said before, to avoid ground fire and enemy fighters. They were flying at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, roughly the height of Mount Everest, to put it in perspective for you guys. And the crews suffered from hypoxia, which was confusion, from the lack of oxygen, and decompression sickness from the low pressure, amongst other ills. I mean, goodness me. Long range... Sorry?
The bends. Divers get the bends as well. That's why I have to go into decompression chambers.
Exactly. I mean, when you start looking at it, long-range bombing missions could last up to 8 to 10 hours under these grueling conditions. I mean, now, we moan if we have to do a 4-hour shift without a break.
That sounds like me and my new job.
Do you see what I mean? When you start really breaking it down, you can start understanding how hallucinations would start kicking in under these extreme conditions. So, it's hardly a surprise that gremlins became a thing. Now, passing the buck was very much a theme on these. So it deflected the blame for human error by blaming accidents on these fantastical creatures. This could have been, it helped to build the morale for the men. And it was more constructive at that time to blame the gremlins for aircraft mishaps rather than accuse members of your own squadron. I mean, bearing in mind, you've got to remember the mentality that needed to be carried on and on before, whilst flying these missions. I mean, you can't have a team that's sort of like fractured, can you, under these conditions?
They need to be like us. They need to be like our team. We're just loopy and don't give a monkeys.
Got to keep your nerve, got to do the job in hand.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much my teenage years gone.
That's true. That's very true. Now, survivors of the war who have lived to tell the tale have no doubt in their minds that the gremlins were a very real threat, and that they were not just merely folklore or spooky legend, and adamantly refuse that all cases can be explained away merely by hallucinations or human error. But I would reiterate, under those kind of conditions, under those kind of circumstances, I would pretty much put it down to that, and it was changed into a propaganda method to keep that morale and mindset going by the RAF. I mean, when you hear tales after tales, turn it into a positive rather than a negative. And most of the reports of these largely fizzled out in the wake of the World War's end. And by the 1950s, there's very little talk about gremlins amongst the airmen.
I was going to say another famous case of the gremlins was Pearl Harbor, but a lot of that, when they've looked back into it, I think was panic because they couldn't get a lot of the planes started when they first knew that they were being invaded and they were attacking them and everything. There was so much panic and everything going around. When they tried to start the planes to get them up into the air to take out the Zeros, a lot of them wouldn't start purely because where they were panicking so much, they'd forgotten to do basic things, but it was all blamed on gremlins.
That's very true. Now, we've actually come to the end of the show, unfortunately. So we thought we'd have a look at the gremlins because it linked into the folklorist thing and, you know, tales of legends and stuff like that. Now, we are going to revisit the Ghosts in the Machine series that we seem to be on at the moment. The next show, though, next week, we're actually going to be taking a break and we are talking to the guys from Paranormal Investigators Northern Ireland, which I'm really looking forward to. They sound like a completely mad bunch. So join us next Friday for Paranormal Investigators Northern Ireland. But after that, we're actually going to continue with this, with planes, trains and automobiles.
Yes, exactly. And another thing I will say is we'll be in Yorkshire then. And also, we have been asked by a certain other paranormal team if we would be interested in doing a joint investigation with them. So we could possibly do something about that as well in the future. We're
definitely going to do that in the future. Next week, join us. We're doing Paranormal Investigators Northern Ireland. They're joining us on the show. That's next Friday. We do have shows going out every single night of the week these days. So don't forget, 9 p.m, this is the place you need to be. If you do miss any of our shows, you can catch up as they all go to podcast afterwards on Spreaker or even on YouTube. Anyway, on that note, thanks ever so much, Mark. It's been a fascinating look at gremlins tonight.
It has, and there was only one alien thing, and then you went off on a tangent about one of them dressed up in a feather boa, and we're just not going to go there, you know.
On that note, thanks ever so much for listening, guys, and we bid you a very farewell.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for
Good night.
Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.